This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Bleak House by Charles Dickens, Chapter 5, A Morning Adventure. Although the morning was raw, and although the fog still seemed heavy, I say seemed, for the windows were so encrusted with dirt that they would have made midsummer sunshine dim, I was sufficiently forewarned of the discomfort within doors at that early hour, and sufficiently curious about London, to think it a good idea on the part of Miss Jellyby when she proposed that we should go out for a walk. "Ma won't be down for ever so long," she said, "and then it's a chance if breakfast's ready for an hour afterwards. They dawdle so. As to Pa, he gets what he can, and goes to the office. He never has what you would call a regular breakfast. Priscilla leaves him out the loaf in some milk, when there is any, overnight. Sometimes there isn't any milk, and sometimes the cat drinks it. But I'm afraid you must be tired, Miss Summerson, and perhaps you would rather go to bed." "I am not at all tired, my dear," said I, "and would much prefer to go out." "If you're sure you would," returned Miss Jellyby, "I'll get my things on." Ada said she would go too, and was soon astir. I made a proposal to Peepy, in default of being able to do anything better for him, that he should let me wash him, and afterward lay him down on my bed again. To this he submitted with the best grace possible, staring at me during the whole operation, as if he never had been, and never could again be, so astonished in his life. Looking very miserable also, certainly, but making no complaint, and going snugly to sleep as soon as it was over. At first I was in two minds about taking such a liberty, but I soon reflected that nobody in the house was likely to notice it. What with the bustle of dispatching Peepy, and the bustle of getting myself ready and helping Ada, I was soon quite in a glow. We found Miss Jellyby trying to warm herself at the fire in the writing-room, which Priscilla was then lighting with a smutty parlour candlestick, throwing the candle in to make it burn better. Everything was just as we had left it last night, and was evidently intended to remain so. Below stairs the dinner cloth had not been taken away, but had been left ready for breakfast. Crumbs, dust, and waste paper were all over the house. Some pewter pots and a milk can hung on the area railings. The door stood open, and we met the cook round the corner coming out of a public house, wiping her mouth. She mentioned, as she passed us, that she had been to see what o'clock it was. But before we met the cook, we met Richard, who was dancing up and down Tavies Inn to warm his feet. He was agreeably surprised to see us stirring so soon, and said he would gladly share our walk. So he took care of Ada, and Miss Jellyby and I went first. I may mention that Miss Jellyby had relapsed into her sulky manner, and that I really should not have thought she liked me much, unless she had told me so. "Where would you wish to go?" she asked. "Anywhere, my dear," I replied. "Anywhere's nowhere," said Miss Jellyby, stopping perversely. "Let us go somewhere at any rate," said I. "You needn't laugh, Miss Summerson. You wouldn't like it yourself. You call yourself very good-tempered." "Really, I don't, my dear," said I. "You do. You know you do, Miss Summerson. Don't say you don't. You do. I beg your pardon. I mean you are," she said with quick and yet grudging concession. "Don't be angry with me, dear. I am so provoked." She then walked me on very fast. "I don't care," she said. "Now you are my witness, Miss Summerson. I say I don't care. But if he was to come to our house with his great shiny, lumpy forehead night after night, till he was old as Methuselah, I wouldn't have anything to say to him. Such asses as he and Ma make of themselves." "My dear," I remonstrated, in allusion to the epithet, and the vigorous emphasis Miss Jellyby set upon it. "Your duty as a child—" "Oh, don't talk of duty as a child, Miss Summerson. Where's Ma's duty as a parent? All made over to the public in Africa, I suppose. Then let the public in Africa show duty as a child. It's much more their affair than mine. You are shocked, I dare say. Very well, so am I shocked too. We are both shocked, and there's an end of it." She walked me on faster yet. "But for all that, I say again, he may come and come and come, and I won't have anything to say to him. I can't bear him. If there's any stuff in the world that I hate and detest, it's the stuff he and Ma talk. I wonder the very paving stones opposite our house can have the patience to stay there and be a witness to such inconsistencies and contradictions as all that sounding nonsense, and Ma's management." I could not but understand her to refer to Mr. Quayle, the young gentleman who had appeared after dinner yesterday. I was saved the disagreeable necessity of pursuing the subject by Richard and Ada coming up at a round pace, laughing, and asking us if we meant to run a race. Thus interrupted, Miss Jellyby became silent and walked moodily on at my side, while I admired the long succession and varieties of streets, the quantity of people already going to and fro, the number of vehicles passing and repassing, the busy preparations in the setting forth of shop windows and the sweeping out of shops, and the extraordinary creatures in rags, secretly groping among the swept-out rubbish for pins and other refuse. "So, cousin," said the cheerful voice of Richard to Ada behind me, "we are never to get out of Chancery. We have come by another way to our place of meeting yesterday. And by the Great Seal, here's the old lady again." Truly, she was immediately in front of us, curtsying and smiling, and saying, with her yesterday's air of patronage, "The Wards in Jarndyce! Very happy, I am sure." "You are out early, ma'am," said I, as she curtsied to me. "Yes, I usually walk here early, before the court sits. It's retired. I collect my thoughts here for the business of the day," said the old lady mincingly. "The business of the day requires a great deal of thought. Chancery justice is so very difficult to follow." "Who's this, Miss Summerson?" whispered Miss Jellyby, drawing my arm tighter through her own. The little old lady's hearing was remarkably quick. She answered for herself directly. "A suitor, my child, at your service. I have the honour to attend court regularly. With my document. Have I the pleasure of addressing another of the youthful parties in jaundice?" said the old lady, recovering herself with her head on one side, and from a very low curtsy. Richard, anxious to atone for the thoughtlessness of yesterday, good-naturedly explained that Miss Jellyby was not connected with the suit. "Ha!" said the old lady. "She does not expect a judgment? She will still grow old, but not so old. Oh dear, no. This is the garden of Lincoln's Inn. I call it my garden. It is quite a bower in the summer-time. When the birds sing melodiously, I pass the greater part of the long vacation here, in contemplation. You find the long vacation exceedingly long, don't you?" We said yes, as she seemed to expect us to say so. "When the leaves are falling from the trees, and there are no more flowers in bloom to make up into nosegays for the Lord Chancellor's court," said the old lady, "the vacation is fulfilled, and the sixth seal, mentioned in the Revelations, again prevails. Pray come and see my lodging. It will be a good omen for me. Youth and hope and beauty are very seldom there." It is a long, long time since I had a visit from either." She had taken my hand, and leading me and Miss Jellyby away, beckoned Richard and Ada to come too. I did not know how to excuse myself, and looked to Richard for aid. As he was half amused and half curious, and all in doubt how to get rid of the old lady without offence, she continued to lead us away, and he and Ada continued to follow, our strange conductress informing us all the time, with much smiling condescension, that she lived close by. It was quite true, as it soon appeared. She lived so close by that we had not time to have done humouring her for a few minutes before she was at home. Slipping us out at a little side gate, the old lady stopped most unexpectedly in the narrow back street, part of some courts and lanes immediately outside the wall of the inn, and said, "This is my lodging. Pray walk up." She had stopped at a shop over which was written, "Crook, Rag and Bottle Warehouse." Also, in long thin letters, "Crook, Dealer in Marine Stores." In one part of the window was a picture of a red paper mill, at which a cart was unloading a quantity of sacks of old rags. In another was the inscription, "Bones Bought." In another, "Kitchen Stuff Bought." In another, "Old Iron Bought." In another, "Waste Paper Bought." In another, "Ladies' and Gentlemen's Wardrobes Bought." Everything seemed to be bought and nothing to be sold there. In all parts of the window were quantities of dirty bottles, blacking bottles, medicine bottles, ginger beer and soda water bottles, pickle bottles, wine bottles, ink bottles. I am reminded, by mentioning the latter, that the shop had, in several particulars, the air of being in a legal neighbourhood, and of being, as it were, a dirty hanger-on and disowned relation of the law. There were a great many ink bottles. There was a little tottering bench of shabby old volumes outside the door, labelled "Law Books," all at 9d. Some of the inscriptions I have enumerated were written in law hand, like the papers I had seen in Kenji and Carboy's office, and the letter I had so long received from the firm. Among them was one, in the same writing, having nothing to do with the business of the shop, but announcing that a respectable man, aged 45, wanted engrossing or copying to execute with neatness and dispatch. Address to Nemo, care of Mr. Crook within. There were several second-hand bags, blue and red, hanging up. A little way within the shop door lay heaps of old crackled parchment scrolls and discoloured and dog-eared law papers. I could have fancied that all the rusty keys, of which there must have been hundreds huddled together as old iron, had once belonged to doors of rooms or strong chests in lawyers' offices. The litter of rags tumbled partly into and partly out of a one-legged wooden scale, hanging without any counterpoise from a beam, might have been counsellors' bands and gowns torn up. One had only to fancy, as Richard whispered to Ada and me while we all stood looking in, that yonder bones in a corner, piled together and picked very clean, were the bones of clients, to make the picture complete. As it was still foggy and dark, and as the shop was blinded besides by the wall of Lincoln's Inn, intercepting the light within a couple of yards, we should not have seen so much but for a lighted lantern that an old man in spectacles and a hairy cap was carrying about in the shop. Turning toward the door, he now caught sight of us. He was short, cadaverous, and withered, with his head sunk sideways between his shoulders, and the breath issuing invisible smoke from his mouth, as if he were on fire within. His throat, chin, and eyebrows were so frosted with white hairs, and so gnarled with veins and puckered skin, that he looked from his breast upward like some old root in a fall of snow. "Hi, hi!" said the old man, coming to the door. "Have you anything to sell?" We naturally drew back and glanced at our conductress, who had been trying to open the house door with a key she had taken from her pocket, and to whom Richard now said that, as we had had the pleasure of seeing where she lived, we would leave her, being pressed for time. But she was not to be so easily left. She became so fantastically and pressingly earnest in her entreaties that we would walk up and see her apartment for an instant, and was so bent in her harmless way on leading me in as part of the good omen she desired, that I, whatever the others might do, saw nothing for it but to comply. I suppose we were all more or less curious, at any rate, when the old man added his persuasions to hers, and said, "Ay, ay, please her, it won't take a minute. Come in, come in. Come in through the shop, if the other door's out of order." And we all went in, stimulated by Richard's laughing encouragement, and relying on his protection. "My landlord, Krook," said the old lady, condescending to him from her lofty station, as she presented him to us. "He is called among the neighbours the Lord Chancellor. His shop is called the Court of Chancery. He is a very eccentric person. He is very odd. Oh, I assure you, he is very odd." She shook her head a great many times, and tapped her forehead with her finger, to express to us that we must have the goodness to excuse him. "For he is a little, you know, said the old lady with great stateliness. The old man overheard and laughed. "'Tis true enough," he said, going before us with the lantern, "that they call me the Lord Chancellor, and call my shop Chancery. And why do you think they call me the Lord Chancellor, and my shop Chancery?" "I don't know, I am sure," said Richard, rather carelessly. "You see," said the old man, stopping and turning round. Hi, here's lovely hair. I have got 3 sacks of ladies' hair below, but none so beautiful and fine as this. What colour, and what texture!" "That'll do, my good friend," said Richard, strongly disapproving of his having drawn one of Ada's tresses through his yellow hand. "You can admire as the rest of us do, without taking that liberty." The old man darted at him a sudden look, which even called my attention from Ada, who, startled and blushing, was so remarkably beautiful that she seemed to fix the wandering attention of the little old lady herself. But as Ada interposed and laughingly said she could only feel proud of such genuine admiration, Mr. Krook shrunk into his former self as suddenly as he had leaped out of it. "You see, I have so many things here," he resumed, holding up the lantern, "of so many kinds, and all as the neighbours think, but they know nothing, wasting away and going to rack and ruin, and that's why they have given me and my place a christening. And I have so many old parchmentses and papers in my stock, and I have a liking for rust and must and cobwebs, and all's fish that comes to my net, and I can't bear to part with anything I once lay hold of, or so my neighbours think, but what do they know? Or to alter anything, or to have any sweeping, nor scouring, nor cleaning, nor repairing going on about me. That's the way I got the ill name of Chancery. I don't mind. I go to see my noble and learned brother pretty well every day, when he sits in the inn. He don't notice me, but I notice him. There's no great odds betwixt us. We both grub on in a muddle. Hi, Lady Jane!" A large grey cat leapt from some neighbouring shelf on his shoulder and startled us all. "Hi, show 'em how you scratch." "Hi, tear, my lady," said her master. The cat leaped down and ripped at a bundle of rags with her tigerish claws, with a sound that it set my teeth on edge to hear. "She'll do as much for anyone I was to set her on," said the old man. "I deal in catskins among other general matters, and hers was offered to me. It's a very fine skin, as you may see, but I didn't have it stripped off. That weren't like chancery practice, though, says you." He had by this time led us across the shop, and now opened a door in the back part of it, leading to the house entry. As he stood with his hand upon the lock, the little old lady graciously observed to him before passing out, "That will do, Crook. You mean well, but are tiresome. My young friends are pressed for time. I have none to spare myself, having to attend court very soon. My young friends are the wards in Jarndyce." "Jarndyce," said the old man with a start. "Jarndyce and Jarndyce, the great suit, Crook," returned his lodger. "Hi!" exclaimed the old man in a tone of thoughtful amazement, and with a wider stare than before. "Think of it!" He seemed so rapt all in a moment, and looked so curiously at us, that Richard said, "Why, you appear to trouble yourself a good deal about the causes before your noble and learned brother, the other chancellor." "Yes," said the old man abstractedly. "Sure, your name now will be Richard Carstone." "Carstone," he repeated, slowly checking off that name upon his forefinger, and each of the others he went on to mention upon a separate finger. "Yes, there was the name of Barbary, and the name of Clare, and the name of Dedlock too, I think." "He knows as much of the cause as the real salaried chancellor," said Richard, quite astonished, to Ada and me. "Aye," said the old man, coming slowly out of his abstraction. "Yes, Tom Jarndyce. You'll excuse me, being related, but he was never known about court by any other name, and was as well known there as she is now," nodding slightly at his lodger. "Tom Jarndyce was often in here. He got into a restless habit of strolling about when the cause was on or expected, talking to the little shopkeepers and telling 'em to keep out of chancery, whatever they did. 'For,' says he, 'it's being ground to bits in a slow mill. It's being roasted at a slow fire. It's being stung to death by single bees. It's being drowned by drops. It's going mad by grains.' He was as near making away with himself, just where the young lady stands, as near could be." We listened with horror. "He come in at the door," said the old man, slowly pointing an imaginary track along the shop, "on the day he did it. The whole neighbourhood had said for months before that he would do it, of a certainty, sooner or later. He come in at the door that day, and walked along there, and sat himself on a bench that stood there, and asked me, you'll judge I was a mortal sight younger then, to fetch him a pint of wine. 'For,' says he, 'Crook, I am much depressed. My cause is on again, and I think I'm nearer judgment than I ever was.' I hadn't a mind to leave him alone, and I persuaded him to go to the tavern over the way there, to the other side my lane, I mean Chancery Lane. And I followed and looked in at the window, and saw him, comfortable as I thought in the armchair by the fire, and company with him. I hadn't hardly got back here when I heard a shot go echoing and rattling right away into the inn. I ran out. Neighbours ran out. 20 of us cried at once, "Tom Jarndyce!" The old man stopped, looked hard at us, looked down into the lantern, blew the light out, and shut the lantern up. We were right, I needn't tell the present hearers. Hi! To be sure, how the neighbourhood poured into court that afternoon while the cause was on. How my noble and learned brother, and all the rest of 'em, grubbed and muddled away as usual, and tried to look as if they hadn't heard a word of the last fact in the case, or as if they had, oh dear me, nothing at all to do with it, if they had heard of it by any chance. Ada's colour had entirely left her, and Richard was scarcely less pale. Nor could I wonder, judging even from my emotions, and I was no party in the suit, that to hearts so untried and fresh it was a shock to come into the inheritance of a protracted misery, attended in the minds of many people with such dreadful recollections. I had another uneasiness in the application of the painful story to the poor half-witted creature who had brought us there. But to my surprise, she seemed perfectly unconscious of that, and only led the way upstairs again, informing us, with the toleration of a superior creature for the infirmities of a common mortal, that her landlord was a little, you know. She lived at the top of the house, in a pretty large room, from which she had a glimpse of Lincoln's Inn Hall. This seemed to have been her principal inducement originally for taking up her residence there. She could look at it, she said, in the night, especially in the moonshine. Her room was clean, but very, very bare. I noticed the scantiest necessaries in the way of furniture. A few old prints from books, of chancellors and barristers, wafered against the wall, and some half-dozen reticules and work-bags, containing documents, as she informed us. There were neither coals nor ashes in the grate, and I saw no article of clothing anywhere, nor any kind of food. Upon a shelf in an open cupboard were a plate or two, a cup or two, and so forth, but all dry and empty. There was a more affecting meaning in her pinched appearance, I thought, as I looked round, than I had understood before. "Extremely honoured, I am sure," said our poor hostess, with the greatest suavity, "by this visit from the Wards in Jarndyce, and very much indebted for the omen. It is a retired situation, considering I am limited as to situation, in consequence of the necessity of attending on the Chancellor. I have lived here many years. I pass my days in court, my evenings and my night here. I find the nights long, for I sleep but little and think much. That is, of course, unavoidable, being in Chancery. I am sorry I cannot offer chocolate. I expect a judgment shortly, and shall then place my establishment on a superior footing. At present I don't mind confessing to the Wards in Jarndyce, in strict confidence, that I sometimes find it difficult to keep up a genteel appearance. I have felt the cold here. I have felt something sharper than cold. It matters very little. Pray excuse the introduction of such mean topics." She partly drew aside the curtain of the long, low garret window, and called our attention to a number of bird cages hanging there, some containing several birds. There were larks, linnets, and goldfinches. I should think at least 20. "I began to keep the little creatures," she said, "with an object that the Wards will readily comprehend, with the intention of restoring them to liberty, when my judgment should be given. Yes, they die in prison, though. Their lives, poor silly things, are so short in comparison with Chancery proceedings, that one by one The whole collection has died over and over again. I doubt, do you know, whether one of these, though they are all young, will live to be free. Very mortifying, is it not? Although she sometimes asked a question, she never seemed to expect a reply, but rambled on as if she were in the habit of doing so, when no one but herself was present. Indeed, she pursued, I positively doubt sometimes, I do assure you, whether, while matters are still unsettled, and the sixth or great seal still prevails, I may not one day be found lying stark and senseless here, as I have found so many birds. Richard, answering what he saw in Ada's compassionate eyes, took the opportunity of laying some money, softly and unobserved, on the chimney-piece. We all draw nearer to the cages, feigning to examine the birds. I can't allow them to sing much, said the little old lady, for, you'll think this curious, I find my mind confused by the idea that they are singing while I am following the arguments in court. And my mind requires to be so very clear, you know. Another time I'll tell you their names, not at present. On a day of such good omen, they shall sing as much as they like, in honour of youth. A smile and a curtsy. Hope, a smile and curtsy. And beauty, a smile and curtsy. There, we'll let in the full light. The birds began to stir and chirp. I cannot admit the air freely, said the little old lady. The room was close, and would have been the better for it, because the cat you saw downstairs, called Lady Jane, is greedy for their lives. She crouches on the parapet outside for hours and hours, I have discovered, whispering mysteriously, that her natural cruelty is sharpened by a jealous fear of their regaining their liberty, in consequence of the judgment I expect being given shortly. She is sly and full of malice. I half believe sometimes that she is no cat, but the wolf of the old saying. It is so very difficult to keep her from the door. Some neighbouring bells, reminding the poor soul that it was 9:30, did more for us in the way of bringing our visit to an end than we could easily have done for ourselves. She hurriedly took up her little bag of documents, which she had laid upon the table on coming in, and asked if we were also going into court. On our answering no, and that we would on no account detain her, she opened the door to attend us downstairs. Which, with such an omen, it is even more necessary than usual I should be there before the Chancellor comes in, she said, for he might mention my case the first thing. I have a presentiment that he will mention it the first thing this morning. She stopped to tell us in a whisper, as we were going down, that the whole house was filled with strange lumber which her landlord had bought piecemeal and had no wish to sell, in consequence of being a little This was on the first floor, but she had made a previous stoppage on the second floor, and had silently pointed at a dark door there. The only other lodger, she now whispered in explanation, a law writer. The children in the lanes here say he has sold himself to the devil. I do not know what he can have done with the money. Hush! She appeared to mistrust that the lodger might hear her, even there, and repeating, hush, went before us on tiptoe, as though even the sound of her footsteps might reveal to him what she had said. Passing through the shop on our way out, as we had passed through it on our way in, we found the old man storing a quantity of packets of waste paper in a kind of well in the floor. He seemed to be working hard, with the perspiration standing on his forehead, and had a piece of chalk by him, with which, as he put each separate package or bundle down, he made a crooked mark on the panelling of the wall. Richard and Ada and Miss Jellyby and the little old lady had gone by him, and I was going, when he touched me on the arm to stay me, and chalked the letter J upon the wall, in a very curious manner, beginning with the end of the letter, and shaping it backward. It was a capital letter, not a printed one, but just such a letter as any clerk in Messrs. Kenji and Carboy's office would have made. "Can you read it?" he asked me with a keen glance. "Surely," said I, "it's very plain." "What is it?" "J." With another glance at me, and a glance at the door, he rubbed it out, and turned an A in its place, not a capital letter this time, and said, "What's that?" I told him. He then rubbed that out, and turned the letter R, and asked me the same question. He went on quickly until he had formed, in the same curious manner, beginning at the ends and bottom of the letters, the word jaundice, without once leaving two letters on the wall together. "What does that spell?" he asked me. When I told him, he laughed. In the same odd way, yet with the same rapidity, he then produced singly, and rubbed out singly, the letters forming the words Bleak House. These, in some astonishment, I also read, and he laughed again. "Hi!" said the old man, laying aside the chalk. "I have a turn for copying from memory, you see, miss, though I can neither read nor write." He looked so disagreeable, and his cat looked so wickedly at me, as if I were a blood relation of the birds upstairs, that I was quite relieved by Richard's appearing at the door and saying, "Miss Summerson, I hope you are not bargaining for the sale of your hair. Don't be tempted. 3 sacks below are quite enough for Mr. Crook." I lost no time in wishing Mr. Crook good morning, and joining my friends outside, where we parted with the little old lady, who gave us her blessing with great ceremony, and renewed her assurance of yesterday in reference to her intention of settling estates on Ada and me. Before we finally turned out of those lanes, we looked back and saw Mr. Crook standing at his shop door, in his spectacles, looking after us, with his cat upon his shoulder, and her tail sticking up on one side of his hairy cap like a tall feather. "Quite an adventure for a morning in London," said Richard with a sigh. "Ah, cousin, cousin, it's a weary world, this Chancery." "It is to me, and has been ever since I can remember," returned Ada. "I am sure." "To me too," said Richard thoughtfully. "If the Lord Chancellor would decide against my interest as far as that is concerned, or at least would say I was only entitled to—" "How much could you and I live on, Esther?" said Ada, blushing. "No," cried Richard, "he had better decide against me. I can go anywhere, go for a soldier, if that's all, and never be missed. I would sell my best chance, if I could, on the shortest notice and the lowest terms." "And go abroad?" said Ada. "Yes. To India, perhaps?" "Why, yes, I think so," returned Richard. "I have not thought about it," said Ada. "I am only grieved that I should be the enemy, as I suppose I am, of a great number of relations and others, and that they should be my enemies, as I suppose they are, and that we should all be ruining one another without knowing how or why, and be in constant doubt and discord all our lives. It seems very strange, as there must be right somewhere, that an honest judge in real earnest has not been able to find out through all these years where it is." "Ah, cousin," said Richard, "strange indeed. All this wasteful, wanton chess-playing is very strange. To see that composed court yesterday jogging on so serenely, and to think of the wretchedness of the pieces on the board, gave me the headache and the heartache both together. My head ached with wondering how it happened, if men were neither fools nor rascals, and my heart ached to think they could possibly be either. But at all events, Ada." "I may call you Ada?" "Of course you may, Cousin Richard. At all events, Chancery will work none of its bad influences on us. We have happily been brought together, thanks to our good kinsman, and it can't divide us now." "Never, I hope, Cousin Richard," said Ada gently. Miss Jellyby gave my arm a squeeze, and me a very significant look. I smiled in return, and we made the rest of the way back very pleasantly. In half an hour after our arrival, Mrs. Jellyby appeared, and in the course of an hour the various things necessary for breakfast straggled one by one into the dining-room. I do not doubt that Mrs. Jellyby had gone to bed and got up in the usual manner, but she presented no appearance of having changed her dress. She was greatly occupied during breakfast, for the morning's post brought a heavy correspondence relative to Borrioboola, which would occasion her, she said, to pass a busy day. The children tumbled about, and notched memoranda of their accidents in their legs, which were perfect little calendars of distress. And Peepy was lost for an hour and a half, and brought home from Newgate Market by a policeman. The equable manner in which Mrs. Jellyby sustained both his absence and his restoration to the family circle surprised us all. She was by that time perseveringly dictating to Caddy, and Caddy was fast relapsing into that inky condition in which we had found her. At 1 o'clock an open carriage arrived for us, and a cart for our luggage. Mrs. Jellyby charged us with many remembrances to her good friend, Mr. Jarndyce. Caddy left her desk to see us depart, kissing me in the passage, and stood biting her pen and sobbing on the steps. Peepy, I am happy to say, was asleep and spared the pain of separation. I was not without misgivings that he had gone to Newgate Market in search of me. And all the other children got up behind the barouche and fell off, and we saw them with great concern, scattered over the surface of Tavy's Inn as we rolled out of its precincts. End of chapter 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Bleak House by Charles Dickens, Chapter 6. Quite at Home. The day had brightened very much, and still brightened as we went westward. We went our way through the sunshine and the fresh air, wondering more and more at the extent of the streets, the brilliancy of the shops, the great traffic, and the crowds of people whom the pleasanter weather seemed to have brought out like many-coloured flowers. By and by we began to leave the wonderful city and to proceed through suburbs which, of themselves, would have made a pretty large town, in my eyes. And at last we got into a real country road again, with windmills, rickyards, milestones, farmers' wagons, scents of old hay, swinging signs and horse troughs, trees, fields, and hedgerows. It was delightful to see the green landscape before us and the immense metropolis behind. and when a wagon with a train of beautiful horses, furnished with red trappings and clear-sounding bells, came by us with its music, I believe we could all three have sung to the bells, so cheerful were the influences around. "The whole road has been reminding me of my namesake Whittington," said Richard, "and that wagon is the finishing touch. Hullo! What's the matter?" We had stopped, and the wagon had stopped too. Its music changed as the horses came to a stand, and subsided to a gentle tinkling, except when a horse tossed his head, or shook himself, and sprinkled off a little shower of bell-ringing. "Our postilion is looking after the wagoner," said Richard, "and the wagoner is coming back after us. Good day, friend." The wagoner was at our coach door. "Why, here's an extraordinary thing," added Richard, looking closely at the man. "He has got your name, Ada, in his hat." He had all our names in his hat. Tucked within the band were 3 small notes, one addressed to Ada, one to Richard, and one to me. These the wagoner delivered to each of us respectively, reading the names aloud first. In answer to Richard's inquiry from whom they came, he briefly answered, "Master, sir, if you please," and putting on his hat again, which was like a soft bowl, cracked his whip, reawakening his music, and went melodiously away. "Is that Mr. Jarndyce's wagon?" said Richard, calling to our postboy. "Yes, sir," he replied, "going to London." We opened the notes. Each was a counterpart of the other, and contained these words, in a solid, plain hand: "I look forward, my dear, to our meeting easily, and without constraint on either side. I therefore have to propose that we meet as old friends, and take the past for granted. It will be a relief to you possibly, and to me certainly, and so my love to you. John Jarndyce." I had perhaps less reason to be surprised than either of my companions, having never yet enjoyed an opportunity of thanking one who had been my benefactor and sole earthly dependence through so many years. I had not considered how I could thank him, my gratitude lying too deep in my heart for that. But I now began to consider how I could meet him without thanking him, and felt it would be very difficult indeed. The notes revived, in Richard and Ada, a general impression that they both had, without quite knowing how they came by it, that their cousin Jarndyce could never bear acknowledgments for any kindness he performed, and that, sooner than receive any, he would resort to the most singular expedients and evasions, or would even run away. Ada dimly remembered to have heard her mother tell, when she was a very little child, that he had once done her an act of uncommon generosity, and that on her going to his house to thank him, he happened to see her through a window coming to the door, and immediately escaped by the back gate, and was not heard of for 3 months. This discourse led to a great deal more on the same theme, and indeed it lasted us all day, and we talked of scarcely anything else. If we did, by any chance, diverge into another subject, we soon returned to this, and wondered what the house would be like, and when we should get there, and whether we should see Mr. Jarndyce as soon as we arrived, or after a delay, and what he would say to us, and what we should say to him, all of which we wondered about, over and over again. The roads were very heavy for the horses, but the pathway was generally good, so we alighted and walked up all the hills, and liked it so well that we prolonged our walk on the level ground when we got to the top. At Barnet there were other horses waiting for us, but as they had only just been fed, we had to wait for them too, and got a long fresh walk over a common and an old battlefield before the carriage came up. These delays so protracted the journey that the short day was spent and the long night had closed in before we came to St. Albans, near to which town Bleak House was, we knew. By that time we were so anxious and nervous that even Richard confessed, as we rattled over the stones of the old street, to feeling an irrational desire to drive back again. As to Ada and me, whom he had wrapped up with great care, the night being sharp and frosty, we trembled from head to foot. When we turned out of the town round a corner, and Richard told us that the post-boy, who had for a long time sympathized with our heightened expectation, was looking back and nodding, we both stood up in the carriage, Richard holding Ada lest she should be jolted down, and gazed round upon the open country and the starlit night for our destination. There was a light sparkling on the top of a hill before us, and the driver, pointing to it with his whip and crying, "That's Bleak House," put his horses into a canter and took us forward at such a rate, uphill though it was, that the wheels sent the road drift flying about our heads like spray from a water-mill. Presently we lost the light, presently saw it, presently lost it, presently saw it, and turned into an avenue of trees, and cantered up towards where it was beaming brightly. It was in a window of what seemed to be an old-fashioned house, with 3 peaks in the roof in front, and a circular sweep leading to the porch. A bell was rung as we drew up, and amidst the sound of its deep voice in the still air, and the distant barking of some dogs, and a gush of light from the open door, and the smoking and steaming of the heated horses, and the quickening beating of our own hearts, we alighted in no inconsiderable confusion. "Ada, my love, Esther, my dear, you are welcome. I rejoice to see you. Rick, if I had a hand to spare at present, I would give it you." The gentleman who said these words in a clear, bright, hospitable voice had one of his arms round Ada's waist and the other round mine, and kissed us both in a fatherly way, and bore us across the hall into a ruddy little room all in a glow with a blazing fire. Here he kissed us again, and opening his arms, made us sit down side by side on a sofa ready drawn out near the hearth. I felt that if we had been at all demonstrative, he would have run away in a moment. "Now, Rick," said he, "I have a hand at liberty. A word in earnest is as good as a speech. I am heartily glad to see you. You are at home. Warm yourself." Richard shook him by both hands with an intuitive mixture of respect and frankness, and only saying, though with an earnestness that rather alarmed me, I was so afraid of Mr. Jarndyce's suddenly disappearing, "You are very kind, sir. We are very much obliged to you," laid aside his hat and coat, and came up to the fire. "And how did you like the ride? And how did you like Mrs. Jellyby, my dear?" said Mr. Jarndyce to Ada. While Ada was speaking to him in reply, I glanced, I need not say with how much interest, at his face. It was a handsome, lively, quick face, full of change and motion, and his hair was a silvered iron grey. I took him to be nearer 60 than 50, but he was upright, hearty, and robust. From the moment of his first speaking to us, his voice had connected itself with an association in my mind that I could not define, But now, all at once, a something sudden in his manner, and a pleasant expression in his eyes, recalled the gentleman in the stagecoach 6 years ago, on the memorable day of my journey to Reading. I was certain it was he. I never was so frightened in my life as when I made the discovery, for he caught my glance, and appearing to read my thoughts, gave such a look at the door that I thought we had lost him. However, I am happy to say he remained where he was, and asked me what I thought of Mrs. Jellyby. "She exerts herself very much for Africa, sir," I said. "Nobly," returned Mr. Jarndyce. "But you answer like Ada, whom I had not heard. You all think something else, I see." "We rather thought," said I, glancing at Richard and Ada, who entreated me with their eyes to speak, "that perhaps she was a little unmindful of her home." "Floored!" cried Mr. Jarndyce. I was rather alarmed again. "Well, I want to know your real thoughts, my dear. I may have sent you there on purpose." "We thought that, perhaps," said I, hesitating. "It is right to begin with the obligations of home, sir, and that, perhaps, while these are overlooked and neglected, no other duties can possibly be substituted for them." "The little Jellybys," said Richard, coming to my relief, "are really, I can't help expressing myself strongly, sir, in a devil of a state." "She means well," said Mr. Jarndyce hastily. "The wind's in the east." "It was in the north, sir, as we came down," observed Richard. "My dear Rick," said Mr. Jarndyce, poking the fire, "I'll take an oath it's either in the east or going to be. I am always conscious of an uncomfortable sensation now and then when the wind is blowing in the east." "Rheumatism, sir?" said Richard. "I dare say it is, Rick. I believe it is. And so the little I had my doubts about 'em are in a oh, Lord, yes, it's easterly," said Mr. Jarndyce. He had taken 2 or 3 undecided turns up and down while uttering these broken sentences, retaining the poker in one hand and rubbing his hair with the other, with a good-natured vexation at once so whimsical and so lovable that I am sure we were more delighted with him than we could possibly have expressed in any words. He gave an arm to Ada and an arm to me, and bidding Richard bring a candle, was leading the way out, when he suddenly turned us all back again. "Those little Jellybys, didn't you, now, if it had rained sugar plums or 3-cornered raspberry tarts, or anything of that sort?" said Mr. Jarndyce. "Oh, cousin," Ada hastily began. "Good, my pretty pet. I like cousin. Cousin John, perhaps, is better." "Then cousin John," Ada laughingly began again. "Ha ha! Very good indeed," said Mr. Jarndyce with great enjoyment. "Sounds uncommonly natural. Yes, my dear." "It did better than that. It rained Esther." "Ay?" said Mr. Jarndyce. "What did Esther do?" "Why, cousin John," said Ada, clasping her hands upon his arm and shaking her head at me across him, for I wanted her to be quiet, "Esther was their friend directly. Esther nursed them, coaxed them to sleep, washed and dressed them, told them stories, kept them quiet, brought them keepsakes. My dear girl, I had only gone out with Peepy, after he was found, and given him a little tiny horse. And, cousin John, she softened poor Caroline, the eldest one, so much, and was so thoughtful for me, and so amiable. No, no, I won't be contradicted. Esther, dear, you know it's true." The warm-hearted darling leaned across to her cousin John and kissed me, and then, looking up in his face, boldly said, "At all events, cousin John, I will thank you for the companion you have given me." I felt as if she challenged him to run away, but he didn't. "Where did you say the wind was, Rick?" asked Mr. Jarndyce. "In the north as we came down, sir." "You are right. There's no east in it. A mistake of mine. Come, girls, come and see your home." It was one of those delightfully irregular houses where you go up and down steps out of one room into another, and where you come upon more rooms when you think you have seen all there are, and where there is a bountiful provision of little halls and passages, and where you find still older cottage rooms in unexpected places, with lattice windows and green growth pressing through them. Mine, which we entered first, was of this kind, with an up and down roof that had more corners in it than I ever counted afterwards, and a chimney. There was a wood fire on the hearth, paved all around with pure white tiles, in every one of which a bright miniature of the fire was blazing. Out of this room you went down 2 steps into a charming little sitting room, looking down upon a flower garden, which room was henceforth to belong to Ada and me. Out of this you went up 3 steps into Ada's bedroom, which had a fine broad window, commanding a beautiful view. We saw a great expanse of darkness lying underneath the stars, to which there was a hollow window seat, in which, with a spring lock, 3 dear Adas might have been lost at once. Out of this room you passed into a little gallery, with which the other best rooms, only 2, communicated, and so by a little staircase of shallow steps, with a number of corner stairs in it, considering its length, down the hall. But if, instead of going out at Ada's door, you came back into my room, and went out at the door by which you had entered it, and turned up a few crooked steps that branched off in an unexpected manner from the stairs, you lost yourself in passages, with mangles in them, and 3-cornered tables, and a native Hindu chair, which was also a sofa, a box, and a bedstead, and looked in every form something between a bamboo skeleton and a great bird cage, and had been brought from India, nobody knew by whom or when. From these you came on Richard's room, which was partly library, partly sitting room, part bedroom, and seemed indeed a comfortable compound of many rooms. Out of that you went straight, with a little interval of passage, to the plain room where Mr. Jarndyce slept, all the year round, with his window open, his bedstead without any furniture standing in the middle of the floor for more air, and his cold bath gaping for him in a smaller room adjoining. Out of that you came into another passage, where there were back stairs, and where you could hear the horses being rubbed down outside the stable, and being told to hold up and get over, as they slipped about very much on the uneven stones. Or you might, if you came out at another door, every room had at least 2 doors, go straight down to the hall again by a 6 steps and a low archway, wondering how you got back there, or had ever got out of it. The furniture, old-fashioned rather than old, like the house, was as pleasantly irregular. Ada's sleeping-room was all flowers, in chintz and paper, in velvet and needlework, in the brocade of 2 stiff courtly chairs, which stood, each attended by a little page of a stool for greater state, on either side of the fireplace. Our sitting-room was green, and had, framed and glazed upon the walls, numbers of surprising and surprised birds, staring out of pictures at a real trout in a case, as brown and shining as if it had been served with gravy, at the death of Captain Cook, and at the whole process of preparing tea in China, as depicted by Chinese artists. In my room there were oval engravings of the months, ladies haymaking, in short waists and large hats tied under the chin, for June, smooth-legged noblemen pointing with cocked hats to village steeples for October. Half-length portraits in crayon abounded all through the house, but were so dispersed that I found the brother of a youthful officer of mine in the china closet, and the grey old age of my pretty young bride, with a flower in her bodice, in the breakfast room. As substitutes I had 4 angels of Queen Anne's reign, taking a complacent gentleman to heaven in festoons with some difficulty, and a composition in needlework representing fruit, a kettle, and an alphabet. All the movables, from the wardrobes to the chairs and tables, hangings, glasses, even to the pin-cushions and scent bottles on the dressing-table, displayed the same quaint variety. They agreed in nothing but their perfect neatness, their display of the whitest linen, and their storing up, wheresoever the existence of a drawer, small or large, rendered it possible, of quantities of rose-leaves and sweet lavender. Such, with its illuminated windows, softened lace, softened here and there by shadows of curtains, shining out upon the starlit night, with its light and warmth, with comfort, with its hospitable jingle at a distance of preparations for dinner, with the face of its generous master brightening everything we saw, and just wind enough without to sound a low accompaniment to everything we heard, were our first impressions of Bleak House. "I am glad you like it," said Mr. Jarndyce, when he had brought us round again to Ada's sitting-room. "It makes no pretensions, but it is a comfortable little place, I hope, and will be more so with such bright young looks in it. You have barely half an hour before dinner. There's no one here but the finest creature upon earth, a child." "More children, Esther," said Ada. "I don't mean literally a child," pursued Mr. Jarndyce. "Not a child in years. He is grown up. He is at least as old as I am. But in simplicity and freshness and enthusiasm, and a fine guileless ineptitude for all worldly affairs, he is a perfect child." We felt that he must be very interesting. "He knows Mrs. Jellyby," said Mr. Jarndyce. "He is a musical man, an amateur, but might have been a professional. He is an artist too, an amateur, but might have been a professional. He is a man of attainments and of captivating manners. He has been unfortunate in his affairs, and unfortunate in his pursuits, and unfortunate in his family. But he don't care. He's a child." "Did you imply that he has children of his own, sir?" inquired Richard. "Yes, Rick, half a dozen. More. Nearer a dozen, I should think. But he has never looked after them. How could he? He wanted somebody to look after him. He is a child, you know," said Mr. Jarndyce. "And have the children looked after themselves at all, sir?" inquired Richard. "Why, just as you may suppose," said Mr. Jarndyce, his countenance suddenly falling. "It is said that the children of the very poor are not brought up, but dragged up. Harold Skimpole's children have tumbled up somehow or other. The wind's getting round again, I am afraid. I feel it rather." Richard observed that the situation was exposed on a sharp night. "It is exposed," said Mr. Jarndyce. "No doubt that's the cause. Bleak House has an exposed sound. But you are coming my way. Come along." Our luggage having arrived, and being all at hand, I was dressed in a few minutes, and engaged in putting my worldly goods away, when a maid, not the one in attendance upon Ada, but another, whom I had not seen, brought a basket into my room, with 2 bunches of keys in it, all labelled. "For you, miss, if you please," said she. "For me?" said I. "The housekeeping keys, miss." I showed my surprise, for she added with some little surprise on her own part, "I was told to bring them as soon as you was alone, Miss Summerson, if I don't deceive myself." "Yes," said I, "that is my name." "The large bunch is the housekeeping, and the little bunch is the cellars, miss. Any time you was pleased to appoint to-morrow morning, I was to show you the presses and the things they belonged to." I said I would be ready at 6:30, and, after she was gone, stood looking at the basket, quite lost in the magnitude of my trust. Ada found me thus, and had such a delightful confidence in me when I showed her the keys and told her about them, that it would have been insensibility and ingratitude not to feel encouraged. I knew, to be sure, that it was the dear girl's kindness, but I liked to be so pleasantly cheated. When we went downstairs, we were presented to Mr. Skimpole, who was standing before the fire, telling Richard how fond he used to be, in his school time, of football. He was a little bright creature, with a rather large head, but a delicate face, and a sweet voice, and there was a perfect charm in him. All he said was so free from effort and spontaneous, and was said with such a captivating gaiety, that it was fascinating to hear him talk. Being of a more slender figure than Mr. Jarndyce, and having a richer complexion and browner hair, he looked younger. Indeed, he had more the appearance, in all respects, of a damaged young man than a well-preserved elderly one. There was an easy negligence in his manner, and even in his dress, his hair carelessly disposed, and his neckerchief loose and flowing, as I have seen artists paint their own portraits, which I could not separate from the idea of a romantic youth who had undergone some unique process of depreciation. It struck me as being not at all like the manner or appearance of a man who has advanced in life by the usual road of years, cares, and experiences. I gathered from the conversation that Mr. Skimpole had been educated for the medical profession, and had once lived, in his professional capacity, in the household of a German prince. He told us, however, that as he had always been a mere child in point of weights and measures, and had never known anything about them, except that they disgusted him, he had never been able to prescribe with the requisite accuracy of detail. In fact, he said, he had no head for detail. And he told us, with great humour, that when he was wanted to bleed the prince, or physic any of his people, he was generally found lying on his back, in bed, reading the newspapers, or making fancy sketches in pencil, and couldn't come. The prince at last objecting to this, in which, said Mr. Skimpole in the frankest manner, he was perfectly right, the engagement terminated, and Mr. Skimpole having, as he added with delightful gaiety, nothing to live upon but love, fell in love, and married, and surrounded himself with rosy cheeks. His good friend Jarndyce, and some other of his good friends, then helped him, in quicker or slower succession, to several openings in life, but to no purpose, for he must confess to two of the oldest infirmities in the world. One was that he had no idea of time, the other that he had no idea of money, in consequence of which he never kept an appointment, never could transact any business, and never knew the value of anything. Well, so he had got on in life, and here he was. He was very fond of reading the papers, very fond of making fancy sketches with a pencil, very fond of nature, very fond of art. All he asked of society was to let him live. That wasn't much. His wants were few. Give him the papers, conversation, music, mutton, coffee, landscape, fruit in season, a few sheets of Bristol board, and a little claret, and he asked no more. He was a mere child in the world, but he didn't cry for the moon. He said to the world, "Go your several ways in peace. Wear red coats, blue coats, lawn sleeves, put pen behind your ears, wear aprons, go after glory, holiness, commerce, trade, any object you prefer, only let Harold Skimpole live." All this, and a great deal more, he told us, not only with the utmost brilliancy and enjoyment, but with a certain vivacious candour, speaking of himself as if he were not at all his own affair, as if Skimpole were a third person, as if he knew that Skimpole had his singularities, but still had his claims too, which were the general business of the community and must not be slighted. He was quite enchanting. If I felt at all confused at that early time, in endeavouring to reconcile anything he said with anything I had thought about the duties and accountabilities of life, which I am far from sure of, I was confused by not exactly understanding why he was free of them. Then he was free of them. I scarcely doubt it. He was so very clear about it himself. "I covet nothing," said Mr. Skimpole, in the same light way. "Possession is nothing to me. Here is my friend Jarndyce's excellent house. I feel obliged to him for possessing it. I can sketch it and alter it. I can set it to music. When I am here I have sufficient possession of it, and have neither trouble, cost, nor responsibility. My steward's name, in short, is Jarndyce, and he can't cheat me. We have been mentioning Mrs. Jellyby. There is a bright-eyed woman of a strong will and immense power of business detail, who throws herself into objects with surprising ardour. I don't regret that I have not a strong will and an immense power of business detail to throw myself into objects with surprising ardour. I can admire her without envy. I can sympathize with the objects. I can dream of them. I can lie down on the grass in fine weather and float along an African river, embracing all the natives I meet, as sensible of the deep silence, and sketching the dense overhanging tropical growth as accurately as if I were there. I don't know that it's of any direct use my doing so, but it's all I can do, and I do it thoroughly. There is a great breathing active principle of desire to crush what is false and wrong, and to set up what is right and tender, which we recognize and admire by the name of Jarndyce. I can sympathize with that in the same way. Then, for heaven's sake, having Harold Skimpole, a confiding child, petitioning you, the world, an agglomeration of practical people of business habits, to let him live and admire the human family, do it somehow or other, like good souls, and suffer him to ride his rocking horse. It was plain enough that Mr. Jarndyce had not been neglectful of the adjuration. Mr. Skimpole's general position there would have rendered it so, without the addition of what he presently said. "It's only you, the generous creatures, whom I envy," said Mr. Skimpole, addressing us, his new friends, in an impersonal manner. "I envy you your power of doing what you do. It is what I should revel in myself. I don't feel any vulgar gratitude to you. I almost feel as if you ought to be grateful to me for giving you the opportunity of enjoying the luxury of generosity. I know you like it. For anything I can tell, I may have come into the world expressly for the purpose of increasing your stock of happiness. I may have been born to be a benefactor to you by sometimes giving you an opportunity of assisting me in my little perplexities. Why should I regret my incapacity for details and worldly affairs, when it leads to such pleasant consequences? I don't regret it, therefore." Of all his playful speeches, playful, yet always fully meaning what they expressed, none seemed to be more to the taste of Mr. Jarndyce than this. I had often new temptations, afterwards, to wonder whether it was really singular, or only singular to me, that he, who was probably the most grateful of mankind upon the least occasion, should so desire to escape the gratitude of others. We were all enchanted. I felt it merited tribute to the engaging qualities of Ada and Richard that Mr. Skimpole, seeing them for the first time, should be so unreserved, and should lay himself out to be so exquisitely agreeable. They, and especially Richard, were naturally pleased, for similar reasons, and considered it no common privilege to be so freely confided in by such an attractive man. The more we listened, the more gaily Mr. Skimpole talked, and what with his fine hilarious manner, and his engaging candour, and his genial way of lightly tossing his own weaknesses about, as if he had said, "I am a child, you know. You are designing people compared with me." He really made me consider myself in that light. "But I am gay and innocent. Forget your worldly arts and play with me." The effect was absolutely dazzling. He was so full of feeling, too, and had such a delicate sentiment for what was beautiful or tender, that he could have won a heart by that alone. In the evening, when I was preparing to make tea, and Ada was touching the piano in the adjoining room and softly humming a tune to her cousin Richard, which they had happened to mention, he came and sat down on the sofa near me, and so spoke of Ada that I almost loved him. "She is like the morning," he said, "with that golden hair, those blue eyes, and that fresh bloom on her cheek. She is like the summer morning. The birds here will mistake her for it. We will not call such a lovely young creature as that, who is a joy to all mankind, an orphan. She is the child of the universe." Mr. Jarndyce, I found, was standing near us, with his hands behind him, and an attentive smile upon his face. "The universe," he observed, "makes a rather indifferent parent, I am afraid." "Oh, I don't know," said Mr. Skimpole buoyantly. "I think I do know," said Mr. Jarndyce. "Well," cried Mr. Skimpole, "you know the world, which in your sense is the universe, and I know nothing of it, so you shall have your way. But if I had mine," glancing at the cousins, "there should be no brambles of sordid realities in such a path as that. It should be strewn with roses. It should lie through bowers where there was no spring, autumn, nor winter, but perpetual summer. Age or change should never wither it. The base word money should never be breathed near it. Mr. Jarndyce patted him on the head with a smile, as if he had been really a child, and passing a step or two on, and stopping a moment, glanced at the young cousins. His look was thoughtful, but had a benignant expression in it which I often, how often, saw again, which has long been engraven on my heart. The room in which they were, communicating with that in which he stood, was only lighted by the fire. Ada sat at the piano. Richard stood beside her, bending down. Upon the wall their shadows blended together, surrounded by strange forms, not without a ghostly motion caught from the unsteady fire, though reflecting from motionless objects. Ada touched the notes so softly and sang so low that the wind, sighing away to the distant hills, was as audible as the music. The mystery of the future, and the little clue afforded to it by the voice of the present, seemed expressed in the whole picture. But it is not to recall this fancy, well as I remember it, that I recall the scene. First, I was not quite unconscious of the contrast in respect of meaning and intention between the silent look directed that way and the flow of words that had preceded it. Secondly, though Mr. Jarndyce's glance, as he withdrew it, rested for but a moment on me, I felt as if, in that moment, he confided to me, and knew that he confided to me, and that I received the confidence, his hope that Ada and Richard might one day enter on a dearer relationship. Mr. Skimpole could play on the piano and the violoncello, and he was a composer, had composed half an opera once, but got tired of it, and played what he composed with taste. After tea, we had quite a little concert, in which Richard, who was enthralled by Ada's singing, and told me that she seemed to know all the songs that were ever written, and Mr. Jarndyce and I were the audience. After a little while I missed, first Mr. Skimpole, and afterwards Richard. And while I was thinking how could Richard stay away so long and lose so much, the maid who had given me the keys looked in at the door, saying, "If you please, miss, could you spare a minute?" When I was shut out with her in the hall, she said, holding up her hands, "Oh, if you please, miss, Mr. Carstone says you would come upstairs to Mr. Skimpole's room. He has been took, miss." "Took?" said I. "Took, miss, sudden," said the maid. I was apprehensive that his illness might be of a dangerous kind, but of course I begged her to be quiet and not disturb anyone, and collected myself, as I followed her quickly upstairs, sufficiently to consider what were the best remedies to be applied if it should prove to be a fit. She threw open a door, and I went into a chamber, where, to my unspeakable surprise, instead of finding Mr. Skimpole stretched upon the bed, or prostrate on the floor, I found him standing before the fire, smiling at Richard, while Richard, with a face of great embarrassment, looked at a person on the sofa, in a white great coat, with smooth hair upon his head, and not much of it, which he was wiping smoother, and making less of, with a pocket handkerchief. "Miss Summerson," said Richard hurriedly, "I am glad you are come. You will be able to advise us. Our friend, Mr. Skimpole, don't be alarmed, is arrested for debt." "And really, my dear Miss Summerson," said Mr. Skimpole, with his agreeable candour, "I never was in a situation in which that excellent sense and quiet habit of method and usefulness which anybody must observe in you who has the happiness of being a quarter hour in your society, was more needed. The person on the sofa, who appeared to have a cold in his head, gave such a very loud snort that he startled me. "Are you arrested for much, sir?" I inquired of Mr. Skimpole. "My dear Miss Summerson," said he, shaking his head pleasantly, "I don't know. Some pounds, odd shillings, and halfpence, I think, were mentioned." "It's £24, 16, and 7 halfpenny," observed the stranger. "That's what it is." "And it sounds, somehow it sounds," said Mr. Skimpole, "like a small sum?" The strange man said nothing, but made another snort. It was such a powerful one that it seemed quite to lift him out of his seat. "Mr. Skimpole," said Richard to me, "has a delicacy in applying to my cousin Jarndyce, because he has lately, I think, sir, I understood that you had lately—" "Oh, yes," returned Mr. Skimpole, smiling. Though I forgot how much it was, and when it was, Jarndyce would readily do it again. But I have the epicure-like feeling that I would prefer a novelty in help, that I would rather, and he looked at Richard and me, develop generosity in a new soil, and in a new form of flower. "What do you think will be best, Miss Summerson?" said Richard, aside. I ventured to inquire, generally, before replying, what would happen if the money were not produced. "Jail," said the strange man, coolly putting his handkerchief into his hat, which was on the floor at his feet, "or coavinses." "May I ask, sir, what is coavinses?" said the strange man. A house." Richard and I looked at one another again. It was a most singular thing that the arrest was our embarrassment and not Mr. Skimpole's. He observed us with a genial interest, but there seemed, if I may venture on such a contradiction, nothing selfish in it. He had entirely washed his hands of the difficulty, and it had become ours. I thought, he suggested, as if good-naturedly to help us out, that being parties in a chancery suit concerning, as people say, a large amount of property, Mr. Richard or his beautiful cousin, or both, could sign something, or make over something, or give some sort of undertaking, or pledge, or bond. I don't know what the business name of it may be, but I suppose there is some instrument within their power that would settle this. "Not a bit on it," said the strange man. "Really?" returned Mr. Skimpole. "That seems odd, now, to one who is no judge of these things." "Odd or even," said the stranger gruffly, "I tell you, not a bit on it." "Keep your temper, my good fellow, keep your temper," Mr. Skimpole gently reasoned with him, as he made a little drawing of his head on the fly-leaf of a book. "Don't be ruffled by your occupation. We can separate you from your office. We can separate the individual from the pursuit. We are not so prejudiced as to suppose that in private life you are otherwise than a very estimable man, with a great deal of poetry in your nature, of which you may not be conscious." The stranger only answered with another violent snort, whether in acceptance of the poetry tribute or in disdainful rejection of it, he did not express to me. "Now, my dear Miss Summerson, and my dear Mr. Richard," said Mr. Skimpole gaily, innocently and confidingly, as he looked at his drawing with his head on one side, "here you see me utterly incapable of helping myself, and entirely in your hands. I only ask to be free. That's not much. I only ask to walk to-morrow morning among fallen leaves, and hear them rustle at my feet, instead of pacing across and across the parlour at our friend's coevinces, however worthy coevinces may be, and I have no doubt that Coavince is a worthy man and loves his children. Mine are inexpensive pleasures, and it is not a costly pursuit to walk among fallen leaves and hear them rustle. I ask no more. The butterflies are free. Mankind will surely not deny to Harold Skimpole what it concedes to the butterflies. "My dear Miss Summerson," said Richard in a whisper, "I have £10 that I received from Mr. Kenji. I must try what that will do." I possessed £15, odd shillings, which I had saved from my quarterly allowance during several years. I had always thought that some accident might happen which would throw me suddenly, without any relation or any property, on the world, and had always tried to keep some little money by me, that I might not be quite penniless. I told Richard of my having this little store, and having no present need of it, and I asked him delicately to inform Mr. Skimpole, while I should be gone to fetch it, that we would have the pleasure of paying his debt. When I came back, Mr. Skimpole kissed my hand and seemed quite touched. Not on his own account. I was again aware of that perplexing and extraordinary contradiction, but on ours, as if personal considerations were impossible with him, and the contemplation of our happiness alone affected him. Richard, begging me for the greater grace of the transaction, as he said, to settle with Coavinses, as Mr. Skimpole now jocularly called him, I counted out the money and received the necessary acknowledgment. This, too, delighted Mr. Skimpole. His compliments were so delicately administered that I blushed less than I might have done, and settled with the stranger in the white coat without making any mistakes. He put the money in his pocket and shortly said, "Well, then, I wish you a good evening, miss." "My friend," said Mr. Skimpole, standing with his back to the fire, after giving up the sketch when it was half finished, "I should like to ask you something without offence." I think the reply was, "Cut away, then." "Did you not know this morning now, that you were coming out on this errand?" said Mr. Skimpole. "Knowed it yesterday afternoon at tea time," said Coavinses. "It didn't affect your appetite? Didn't make you at all uneasy?" "Not a bit," said Coavinses. "I knowed if you was missed to-day, you wouldn't be missed to-morrow. A day makes no such odds." "But when you came down here," proceeded Mr. Skimpole, "it was a fine day. The sun was shining, the wind was blowing, the lights and shadows were passing across the fields, the birds were singing." "Nobody said they weren't, in my hearing," returned Coavinses. "No," observed Mr. Skimpole. "But what did you think upon the road?" "What do you mean?" growled Coavinses, with an appearance of strong resentment. "Think! I've got enough to do, and little enough to get for it, without thinking. Thinking!" with profound contempt. "Then you didn't think, at all events," proceeded Mr. Skimpole, to this effect: "Harold Skimpole loves to see the sunshine, loves to hear the wind blow, loves to watch the changing lights and shadows, loves to hear the birds, those choristers in nature's great cathedral. And does it seem to me that I am about to deprive Harold Skimpole of his share in such possessions, which are his only birthright? You thought nothing to that effect?" "I certainly did not," said Coavinses, whose doggedness in utterly renouncing the idea was of that intense kind that he could only give adequate expression to it by putting a long interval between each word, and accompanying the last with a jerk that might have dislocated his neck. Very odd and very curious the mental process is in you men of business, said Mr. Skimpole thoughtfully. Thank you, my friend. Good night. As our absence had been long enough already to seem strange downstairs, I returned at once and found Ada sitting at work by the fireside, talking to her cousin John. Mr. Skimpole presently appeared, and Richard shortly after him. I was sufficiently engaged during the remainder of the evening in taking my first lesson in backgammon from Mr. Jarndyce, who was very fond of the game, and from whom I wished of course to learn it as quickly as I could, in order that I might be of the very small use of being able to play when he had no better adversary. But I thought occasionally, when Mr. Skimpole played some fragments of his own compositions, or when, both at the piano and the violoncello, and at our table, he preserved, with an absence of all effort, his delightful spirits and his easy flow of conversation, that Richard and I seemed to retain the transferred impression of having been arrested since dinner, and that it was very curious altogether. It was late before we separated, for when Ada was going at 11 o'clock, Mr. Skimpole went to the piano and rattled hilariously that the best of all ways to lengthen our days was to steal a few hours from night, my dear. It was past 12 before he took his candle and his radiant face out of the room, and I think he might have kept us there if he had seen fit until daybreak. Ada and Richard were lingering for a few moments by the fire, wondering whether Mrs. Jellyby had yet finished her dictation for the day, when Mr. Jarndyce, who had been out of the room, returned. "Oh, dear me, what's this? What's this?" he said, rubbing his head and walking about with his good-humoured vexation. "What's this, they tell me? Rick, my boy, Esther, my dear, what have you been doing? Why did you do it? How could you do it? How much apiece was it? The wind's round again, I feel it all over me." We neither of us quite knew what to answer. "Come, Rick, come, I must settle this before I sleep. How much are you out of pocket? You two made the money up, you know. Why did you? How could you? Oh, Lord, yes, it's due east, must be." "Really, sir," said Richard, "I don't think it would be honourable in me to tell you. Mr. Skimpole relied upon us." "Lord bless you, my dear boy, he relies upon everybody," said Mr. Jarndyce, giving his head a great rub, and stopping short. "Indeed, sir." "Everybody. And he'll be in the same scrape again next week," said Mr. Jarndyce, walking again at a great pace, with a candle in his hand that had gone out. "He's always in the same scrape. He was born in the same scrape. I verily believe that the announcement in the newspapers when his mother was confined was, 'On Tuesday last, at her residence in Botheration Buildings, Mrs. Skimpole, of a son in difficulties.'" Richard laughed heartily, but added, "Still, sir, I don't want to shake his confidence, or break his confidence, and if I submit to your better knowledge again, that I ought to keep his secret, I hope you will consider before you press me any more. Of course, if you do press me, sir, I shall know I am wrong, and I will tell you." "Well," cried Mr. Jarndyce, stopping again, and making several absent endeavours to put his candlestick in his pocket. "I hear. Take it away, my dear. I don't know what I am about with it. It's all the wind. Invariably has that effect. I won't press you, Rick. You may be right. But really, to get hold of you and Esther, and to squeeze you like a couple of tender young St. Michael's oranges, It'll blow a gale in the course of the night." He was now alternately putting his hands in his pockets, as if he were going to keep them there a long time, and taking them out again, and vehemently rubbing them all over his head. I ventured to take this opportunity of hinting that Mr. Skimpole, being in all such matters quite a child. "Eh, my dear?" said Mr. Jarndyce, catching at the word. "Being quite a child, sir," said I, "and so different from other people." "You are right," said Mr. Jarndyce, brightening. "Your woman's wit hits the mark. He is a child, an absolute child. I told you he was a child, you know, when I first mentioned him." "Certainly, certainly," we said. "And he is a child, now isn't he?" said Mr. Jarndyce, brightening more and more. He was indeed, we said. "When you come to think of it, it's the height of childishness in you, I mean me," said Mr. Jarndyce, "to regard him for a moment as a man. You can't make him responsible. The idea of Harold Skimpole with designs or plans, or knowledge of consequences. Ha, ha, ha!" It was so delicious to see the clouds about his bright face clearing, and to see him so heartily pleased, and to know, as it was impossible not to know, that the source of his pleasure was the goodness which was tortured by condemning, or mistrusting, or secretly accusing anyone, that I saw the tears in Ada's eyes while she echoed his laugh, and felt them in my own. "Why, what a cod's head and shoulder I am," said Mr. Jarndyce, "to require reminding of it. The whole business shows the child from beginning to end. Nobody but a child would have thought of singling you two out for parties in the affair. Nobody but a child would have thought of your having the money. If it had been £1,000, it would have been just the same," said Mr. Jarndyce, with his whole face in a glow. We all confirmed it from our night's experience. To be sure," said Mr. Jarndyce. "However, Rick, Esther, and you too, Ada, for I don't know that even your little purse is safe from his inexperience. I must have a promise all round that nothing of this sort shall ever be done any more. No advances, not even sixpences." We all promised faithfully, Richard, with a merry glance at me, touching his pocket, as if to remind me that there was no danger of our transgressing. "As to Skimpole," said Mr. Jarndyce, "a habitable doll's house with good board, and a few tin people to get into debt with and borrow money of, would set the boy up in life. He is in a child's sleep by this time, I suppose. It's time I should take my craftier head to my more worldly pillow. Good night, my dears. God bless you." He peeped in again, with a smiling face, before we had lighted our candles, and said, "Oh, I have been looking at the weathercock. I find it was a false alarm about the wind. It's in the south," and went away singing to himself. Ada and I agreed, as we talked together for a little while upstairs, that this caprice about the wind was a fiction, and that he used the pretence to account for any disappointment he could not conceal, rather than he would blame the real cause of it, or disparage or depreciate anyone. We thought this very characteristic of his eccentric gentleness, and of the difference between him and those petulant people who make the weather and the winds, particularly that unlucky wind which he had chosen for such a different purpose, the stalking horses of the splenetic and gloomy humours. Indeed, so much affection for him had been added in this one evening to my gratitude, that I hoped I already began to understand him through that mingled feeling. Any seeming inconsistencies in Mr. Skimpole or in Mrs. Jellyby I could not expect to be able to reconcile, having so little experience or practical knowledge. Neither did I try, for my thoughts were busy when I was alone with Ada and Richard, and with the confidence I had seemed to receive concerning them. My fancy, made a little wild by the wind perhaps, would not consent to be all unselfish, either, though I would have persuaded it to be so if I could. It wandered back to my godmother's house, and came along the intervening track, raising up shadowy speculations which had sometimes trembled there in the dark, as to what knowledge Mr. Jarndyce had of my earliest history, even to the possibility of his being my father, though that idle dream was quite gone now. It was all gone now, I remembered, getting up from the fire. It was not for me to muse over bygones, but to act with a cheerful spirit and a grateful heart. So I said to myself, Esther, 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 duty, my dear, and gave my little basket of housekeeping keys such a shake that they sounded like little bells and rang me hopefully to bed. End of chapter 6.